At 0900 hours on February the 19th, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein knelt behind a shallow crater in the black volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, clutching a machine gun his sergeant had dismissed as a foolish notion 3 months prior. He was 23 years old, with 6 prior combat engagements, but 0 traditional kills. The Japanese Imperial Army had fortified nearly every meter of this 8-square-mile island with 11 miles of interlinked tunnels, over 17,000 hardened defenders, and overlapping fields of fire that transformed the landing beach into an absolute slaughterhouse. Stein was among the first men from Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, to secure a position beyond the immediate shoreline. All around him, fellow Marines were pinned down by concentrated, precise machine gun and mortar fire, emanating from cleverly camouflaged pillboxes they simply could not locate. By the middle of the morning, the 5th Marine Division had already suffered 43 casualties. Dead Marines lay scattered across the terraced beach, their bodies contorted in the dark volcanic soot. The standard issue Browning M1919 heavy machine guns were undeniably effective, but they weighed 31 pounds empty and fired a mere 400 rounds per minute. They were excellent for static defense, but utterly unsuitable for a rapid infantry assault. Stein had been aware of this critical weakness for months. Back in November 1944 at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii, he had observed gun crews struggling immensely during rigorous training exercises. The heavy gunners could not keep pace with the swift advance of the rifle platoons. They would set up the tripod, fire a burst, and then waste precious minutes breaking down the weapon and moving it forward. By then, the tactical momentum was invariably lost. Tony Stein was, by trade, a skilled toolmaker. Born in Dayton, Ohio, to Austrian Jewish immigrants who had wisely fled rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, he had spent his teenage years operating a lathe at Patterson Field, then later working as a tool and die maker at Delco Products. He possessed an innate understanding of complex machinery. He knew precisely what mechanical devices could achieve and what their limitations were. When he enlisted in the Paramarines in September 1942, that sharp mechanical mind followed him into combat. On Bougainville, he had single-handedly eliminated 5 Japanese snipers in a single day. However, it was his pronounced ability to aggressively modify and improve military equipment that captured the attention of Sergeant Mel Grevich. Grevich himself had been tinkering with something highly unorthodox during the Bougainville campaign in 1943. He had meticulously salvaged an AN-M2 aircraft machine gun from the wreckage of a crashed Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The AN-M2 was specifically designed for rapid aerial combat. It weighed a mere 21 pounds, a full 10 pounds lighter than the cumbersome M1919. More significantly, it could unleash 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, making it 3 times faster than the standard ground weapon. But there was a major inherent problem. The AN-M2 was equipped with spade grips designed for aircraft mounts. It had no buttstock, no proper sights, and no practical way for a single Marine to carry it, aim accurately, and fire while advancing. When Grevich approached Stein in November 1944, the Paramarines unit had just been officially dissolved. Both men were subsequently reassigned to the 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division. They were already preparing for an operation the high-ranking brass refused to name, but every Marine knew it would be exceptionally violent. Grevich presented the AN-M2 to Stein. Stein immediately recognized the immense combat potential. They worked diligently at night in a secluded maintenance shed. Stein took an M1 Garand buttstock, cut it down, and painstakingly hollowed it out to accommodate the machine gun's necessary buffer tube. He ingeniously fabricated a solenoid trigger mechanism using scraps of sheet metal. Grevich expertly welded a Browning automatic rifle, BR bipod, onto the front of the barrel. They installed bar rear sights for accurate aiming. The resulting weapon was crude but powerful, 25 pounds in weight, fed by a 100-round ammunition box, and capable of emptying that entire box in just 5 seconds of continuous fire. They christened it the Stinger. Stein constructed 6 of them, 1 for each of Company G's 3 rifle platoons, 1 for the demolition section, 1 for Grevich, and 1 for himself. Reactions from other Marines were dramatically mixed. Some immediately hailed it as a brilliant invention. Others darkly predicted it was a death trap. One sergeant took a look at the improvised weapon and flatly stated it would jam on the very first burst. Another argued that the thin aircraft barrel would melt after only 2 magazines. A platoon commander from 2nd Battalion scoffed, saying only an idiot would carry an airplane gun into a ground infantry fight. But when Stein test-fired it on the range, emptying a full box into a target 200 yards away in less than 6 seconds, the widespread skepticism instantly faded. Company and battalion commanders approved its use. The Stinger was going to war. Now, on the ash-covered beach at Iwo Jima, Stein gripped his weapon tightly. The Stinger's barrel was already becoming noticeably warm. Around him, Marines were being killed because they were unable to pinpoint the heavily concealed Japanese positions. Standard procedure called for support from tanks or naval gunfire, but the tanks were hopelessly bogged down in the soft volcanic ash, and naval shells could not hit what the forward observers could not clearly see. Stein made a quick, decisive choice. If you want to see how Corporal Tony Stein's jury-rigged aircraft gun performed in the inferno of Iwo Jima, please hit that like button now. It dramatically helps us share more forgotten stories from the Pacific Theater. Share this video with a friend who appreciates history, and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any future episodes. Now, back to Stein. He stood up fully upright in the center of the beach, a location where Japanese machine gunners possessed clear, overlapping fields of fire. Corporal Tony Stein deliberately exposed himself to draw hostile enemy attention. He needed them to inadvertently reveal their positions. He needed to clearly see the muzzle flashes. Bullets snapped viciously past his head. Mortar rounds detonated violently in the nearby ash. And then Stein finally saw it. A pillbox, 75 yards to the northwest, perfectly camouflaged with volcanic rock and sand. The barrel of a Type 92 heavy machine gun protruded just inches from the surface. Stein swiftly leveled the Stinger, aimed, and squeezed the solenoid trigger. The weapon erupted into a terrifying roar, firing at its full rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. The pillbox immediately disintegrated under the torrent of .30 caliber rounds. 1,200 bullets per minute hammered the volcanic rock and sandbags. The Type 92 fell silent. Through the dust and thick smoke, Stein could briefly see movement inside the position. Then, nothing. He rapidly shifted his aim to a second pillbox 40 yards to the left. Another devastating burst. 5 seconds of continuous concentrated fire. The concrete structure absorbed some of the rounds, but the sheer volume of fire was too overwhelming. The Japanese machine gun crew inside instantly ceased firing. Around Stein, Marines began to move. Seeing the enemy position effectively suppressed, riflemen advanced from their shallow depressions in the sand. Sergeants shouted urgent orders. The stalled assault was moving again. Stein sprinted toward the first pillbox. The Stinger was significantly lighter than the standard M1919, allowing him to run with it. He reached the position in seconds. Inside, 3 dead Japanese soldiers lay on the ground. The bull's 200 rounds per minute rate of fire had simply cut through everything. He moved to the second pillbox. Same deadly result. 2 enemy soldiers down, the position utterly destroyed. But then Stein felt the Stinger suddenly go light in his hands. The ammunition box was empty. 100 rounds were gone in less than 10 seconds of actual trigger time. He had fully anticipated this problem during training in Hawaii, but experiencing it in the heat of combat was entirely different. The Stinger was devastatingly effective. It was also impossibly hungry. Stein glanced back toward the beach, 200 yards away. The ammunition resupply point was located near the waterline, where landing craft were still desperately unloading supplies under sporadic mortar fire. He would have to cross completely open ground, fully exposed, to acquire more linked .30 caliber ammunition. He started running. The volcanic sand made every single step brutally difficult. It was not like normal beach sand. The ash was loose, terraced, and consistently gave way underfoot. Marines grimly called it running through ball bearings. Stein's boots sank 3 inches with every stride. Halfway to the beach, he came upon a wounded Marine, a private first class from 2nd Platoon, suffering a shrapnel wound to the left leg. The man was conscious, but completely unable to walk. Stein grabbed him, quickly slung him over his shoulder, and kept running. The Marine weighed 160 pounds. The Stinger weighed 25. Stein's combat pack added another 30. He was carrying over 215 pounds through treacherous volcanic ash, while Japanese mortars deliberately bracketed the beach. He reached the supply point at Nosin 4-5. Corpsman quickly took the wounded Marine. Stein grabbed 4 fresh ammunition boxes, each containing 100 rounds of linked .30 caliber. He stuffed 2 boxes into his pack, carried 1 in each hand, and immediately turned back toward his platoon's position. The return trip took 3 agonizing minutes. Japanese snipers had already begun actively targeting Marines, moving between the beach and the forward positions. Bullets kicked up black ash around Stein's boots. A mortar round detonated 30 yards to his right, showering him with volcanic rock and shrapnel. He did not slow down. When he reached Company A's position, his platoon sergeant directed him toward a third pillbox. This one was substantially larger, built of reinforced concrete, and contained a Type 96 light machine gun that covered the main approach to the airfield. 2 previous assaults had failed. 4 Marines lay dead directly in front of it. Stein loaded a fresh ammunition box into the Stinger. He checked the belt feed. The weapon was already intensely hot from the previous engagement, but the thin aircraft barrel could somehow handle more. He stood up and advanced on the pillbox alone. The Type 96 opened fire immediately. Rounds snapped viciously past Stein's head and chest. He kept walking forward, the Stinger braced at his shoulder. At 50 yards, he opened fire. The weapon's rate of fire was so high and concentrated that the Japanese gunner inside could not adjust his aim fast enough. Stein's rounds found the firing slit. The enemy gun instantly went silent. He charged the final 20 yards and dropped a grenade through the opening. The resulting explosion killed the 3-man crew inside. Stein turned back to reload. The ammunition box was empty again. He had been in combat for 46 minutes and had already expended 300 rounds. The Stinger was undeniably proving its worth, but the logistical problem was becoming critically clear. This weapon could suppress and destroy enemy positions faster than any standard machine gun, but it would require constant, massive resupply. He started his second run back to the beach. This time he encountered 2 more wounded Marines on the way down. One had a sucking chest wound. The other had lost part of his right hand to shrapnel. Stein couldn't possibly carry both simultaneously. He took the chest wound case first, ran him to the corpsman, grabbed more ammunition, and then made a third dedicated trip, specifically to retrieve the second wounded man. By 10:30, Stein had made 4 trips to the beach and back. Each time, he had carried a seriously wounded Marine to safety. Each time, he had returned with vital ammunition. His platoon had advanced 200 yards inland. They had destroyed 7 enemy positions, and Stein had personally eliminated at least 15 Japanese soldiers. But the Stinger itself was beginning to suffer. The barrel was visibly discolored from the intense heat. The solenoid trigger was starting to stick, and Stein's boots were rapidly disintegrating from the corrosive volcanic ash and the constant running. He looked down at his feet. The soles were nearly gone. The leather was cracked and torn. Running in them was becoming agonizingly painful. Every step sent sharp, searing pains through his arches. Stein made an extraordinary decision. He unlaced his boots, kicked them off, and proceeded to run barefoot in the volcanic ash. The choice seemed insane, but Stein understood the crucial mathematics of combat. Every second mattered. His ruined boots were adding friction and actively slowing him down. The ash was abrasive, but not unbearably hot in the shaded areas. He could move faster without them. He also removed his helmet. The M1 steel pot weighed 212 pounds. Not much, but combined with the boots, he was shedding nearly 5 pounds of equipment. 5 pounds that would allow him to move faster between the beach and his pinned-down platoon. His 5th run to the beach took just 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Barefoot, he could actually gain slight traction in the loose volcanic sand. His feet sank into the ash, but without the rigid boot soles, he could feel the terrain and adjust his stride. It was extremely painful. The ash was coarse, like running on broken glass, but it was undeniably faster. He grabbed another wounded Marine on the way down, suffering shrapnel to the abdomen. The man was unconscious. Stein carried him over his shoulder, delivered him to the corpsman, loaded up on ammunition, and sprinted back to Company A's position. By 1100 hours, Stein had made 6 trips to the beach. He had carried 6 severely wounded Marines to safety. He had brought back 600 rounds of ammunition, and he had personally destroyed 5 more enemy positions. His platoon had advanced 300 yards from the beach. They were now closing in on the first airfield. Japanese resistance was intensifying rapidly. The enemy had constructed an intricate defensive network of pillboxes, spider holes, and underground bunkers connected by tunnels. When one position was destroyed, soldiers would simply emerge from another, resuming the firing. The Stinger was the only weapon in Company A that could deliver enough volume of fire to keep multiple positions suppressed simultaneously. When Stein opened up on one pillbox, the sheer sound alone of 1,800 rounds per minute was sufficient to make adjacent positions hesitate. That momentary hesitation gave riflemen the time they needed to advance and throw grenades. But the weapon was rapidly taking damage. The barrel was now visibly glowing after sustained bursts of fire. The thin aircraft-grade steel was never designed for prolonged ground combat. It was built to be cooled by 300 mph slipstreams during dive bombing runs. On the ground, there was virtually no airflow, just suffocating heat. The solenoid trigger mechanism was also degrading. Stein had fabricated it from scratch using sheet metal in Hawaii, and while it worked, it was not as reliable as a factory-built trigger group. Sometimes it would stick. Sometimes it would fire only one round when he intended a full burst. He often had to forcefully tap it with his palm to reset it. Despite the critical mechanical issues, the Stinger remained incredibly effective. At 11:20, Stein's platoon encountered a heavily reinforced Japanese position that had successfully halted the advance of 2 entire other companies. It was a solid concrete bunker with 3 narrow firing slits strategically positioned to cover the approach to airfield number 1. Inside, there were multiple Type 96 light machine guns, creating interlocking fields of fire. 2 tank destroyers had tried to neutralize it. Both were hit by concealed 47mm anti-tank guns and were forced to withdraw. An airstrike was called in, but the bombs missed by 50 yards. The bunker remained fully operational. Stein studied the position carefully. The firing slits were narrow, perhaps 8 inches wide and 4 inches tall, difficult targets. But the Stinger's sheer rate of fire meant that if he aimed at a slit and held the trigger, statistically, some rounds would penetrate. He advanced alone. 50 yards from the bunker, he went prone and opened fire. The Stinger emptied its 100-round box in 7 seconds. At that range, at least 30 rounds tore through the firing slits. The Japanese guns inside fell silent. Stein reloaded and charged the bunker. He dropped grenades through the openings. The resulting explosions killed the 5-man crew inside. Company A's advance resumed. His 7th trip to the beach came at 11:50. This time he carried a Marine who had lost both legs below the knee to a landmine. The man was still conscious and screaming. Stein ran the entire 200 yards while the Marine bled profusely into his uniform. Corpsman later confirmed that if Stein had been 30 seconds slower, the Marine would have died from rapid blood loss. On the return trip, Stein encountered something unexpected. Another Marine carrying a Stinger. It was one of Grevich's other gunners from Company G. The man's weapon had jammed permanently after severe overheating. The barrel had warped beyond repair. He was carrying it back to the beach to see if an armorer could perform emergency repairs. Stein looked at his own Stinger. The barrel was discolored purple from the immense heat. The wooden furniture on the Garand stock was starting to char. The bipod was loose, but miraculously it still fired. He made his 8th trip to the beach at 12:30. Another wounded Marine, another heavy load of ammunition. By now, other Marines had begun to notice the barefoot corporal making his repeated, relentless runs under fire. Some thought he was completely deranged. Others considered him the bravest man on Iwo Jima. Stein didn't care about either assessment. He thought only about the simple mathematics. His platoon desperately needed ammunition. Wounded men needed immediate evacuation. He was faster without his boots. The Stinger provided him with the necessary firepower to suppress positions while he moved. Everything else was just pure execution. But on his 8th return trip, the situation dramatically changed. A Japanese sniper had moved into position, directly overlooking the supply route. As Stein ran back toward Company A with 4 heavy ammunition boxes, a round snapped past his head. Extremely close, maybe 6 inches away. He dropped flat immediately into the volcanic ash. The Stinger landed beside him. For the first time all day, Tony Stein was pinned down. The sniper was clearly highly skilled. Stein couldn't see the position, but the angle of the shot indicated it was somewhere on the ridgeline, 200 yards to the east, likely in a spider hole or concealed behind volcanic rock. The Japanese had trained their snipers exceptionally well. Patient, disciplined, willing to wait hours for a single high-value target. And a Marine making repeated trips across open ground was definitely high value. Stein lay motionless for 30 seconds. He carefully controlled his breathing. The sniper would be watching for any movement at all. The volcanic ash around Stein's position offered no cover, just flat, open terrain between the beach and the forward positions. Another round cracked overhead. The sniper was firing at where Stein had been, not where he was. That meant the shooter had not yet acquired his precise location. Stein had maybe 10 seconds before the sniper adjusted. He rolled sharply to the left, grabbed the stinger, and came up sprinting. Not toward his platoon, but directly toward the sniper. The mathematics were simple. Running perpendicular to the sniper's line of sight would make him a harder target than running away. And if he could quickly close the distance, the stinger's immense rate of fire would easily overwhelm a slow bolt-action rifle. 3 more shots, all misses. Stein was sprinting now, barefoot through the volcanic ash, the stinger in his hands, ammunition boxes bouncing violently in his pack. At 150 yards, he saw movement. A figure in a spider hole partially concealed by volcanic rock. Stein dropped to one knee and opened fire. The stinger roared. 1-200 rounds per minute shredded the rock and surrounding terrain. The sniper's position disintegrated. When the ammunition box ran empty, there was no return fire. Stein reloaded and approached the position cautiously. The sniper was dead. The Type 97 rifle lay beside him. Stein took the rifle's telescopic sight and continued toward Company A. When he reached his platoon at 1300 hours, the tactical situation had severely deteriorated. Company A had been pinned down by a massive complex of fortifications that included at least 8 pillboxes arranged in a semicircle, creating interlocking fields of fire. Any Marine who stood up was immediately engaged by multiple positions. The company had suffered 12 casualties in the past 20 minutes trying to advance. The company commander had called for tank support, but the M4 Shermans were still hopelessly bogged down near the beach. The volcanic ash was too soft. The tanks kept throwing their tracks or getting utterly stuck. Artillery support was severely limited because forward observers couldn't get clear lines of sight to the entrenched enemy positions. Stein moved to the forwardmost position and quickly assessed the situation. The 8 pillboxes formed an arc about 100 yards ahead. Japanese soldiers were also actively moving through trenches connecting the positions. It wasn't just a static defense, it was a coordinated system. The Stinger's primary advantage was its volume of fire. Stein calculated that if he could suppress multiple positions simultaneously, riflemen could advance rapidly under that suppression, but it would require maximum exposure once again. He stood up and opened fire on the leftmost pillbox. A 5-second burst, 100 rounds. The position immediately went silent. He shifted his aim to the next pillbox. Another burst. Silence. He was methodically working his way across the arc, suppressing each position in sequence. Japanese soldiers in the trenches began firing directly at him. Type 99 rifles, Type 96 light machine guns. Rounds kicked up ash around his bare feet. One bullet struck the Stinger's barrel with a loud metallic clang. The weapon kept firing. Stein emptied his ammunition box and dropped flat to reload. While he reloaded, riflemen from Company A advanced 50 yards. When Stein stood up and resumed firing, they advanced another 50 yards. The coordination was instinctive. No explicit orders were needed. The Marines instinctively understood that when the Stinger was firing, they could move. By 1330, Company A had successfully broken through the defensive arc. 5 of the 8 pillboxes were destroyed. The other 3 were abandoned. 17 Japanese soldiers were confirmed dead. Company A had lost 3 more Marines, but the advance continued. Stein's Stinger was now critically damaged. The barrel was slightly bent from the bullet strike. The bipod had completely broken off. The Garand stock was charred black, but unbelievably it still fired. At 13:45, during the assault on the 6th pillbox, something happened that Stein had trained for, but desperately hoped would never occur. He was firing a sustained burst. When a Japanese Type 96 machine gun scored a direct hit on the Stinger, the impact was violent. The weapon was violently ripped from Stein's hands and thrown 6 feet backward into the volcanic ash. Stein dove for cover behind a low ridge of rock. He was now completely unarmed. The Stinger lay in open ground between his position and the active enemy pillbox. Japanese soldiers had clearly seen it fall. They knew he was disarmed. They were waiting for him to attempt to retrieve it. Stein looked at the weapon lying in the ash. The barrel was smoking. He could see that the belt feed mechanism was damaged. Even if he retrieved it, the Stinger might not fire. But he had carried that weapon through 8 trips to the beach. He had used it to destroy more than 15 enemy positions. It had kept his platoon alive. Stein prepared to run into the open and retrieve it. He sprinted into the open. The Japanese machine gun opened fire immediately. Rounds snapped past his head and torso. Stein ran in a tight zigzag pattern, making himself a more difficult target. 3 seconds to reach the Stinger. He grabbed it, rolled behind another ridge, and quickly checked the weapon. The belt feed was jammed. A round had struck the feed mechanism and bent the guide rails. Stein pulled out the damaged belt, quickly cleared the jam with his fingers, and loaded a fresh ammunition box. The weapon fed correctly. He test-fired a 3-round burst. It worked. He stood up and emptied the entire box into the pillbox that had shot the Stinger from his hands. 100 rounds in 7 seconds. The position was obliterated. The Type 96 that had nearly killed him fell silent permanently. Stein reloaded and continued the assault. By 1400 hours, Company A had advanced 400 yards from the beach. They had destroyed 23 enemy positions. Stein had personally accounted for at least 12 of them. His barefoot runs to the beach had saved 9 wounded Marines. And the Stinger, despite being shot, overheated, and mechanically abused, was still firing. But the weapon's condition was critical. The barrel was now visibly bent. The rate of fire had decreased to maybe 900 rounds per minute. The solenoid trigger was misfiring in bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, even when Stein wanted continuous fire, and the wooden stock was so badly charred that it was beginning to crumble. At 14:30, during an assault on a fortified trench system, the Stinger was hit again. This time, a Type 99 rifle round struck the receiver. The impact knocked the weapon from Stein's hands for the second time. It landed 10 feet away in a shell crater. Stein was now completely exposed. No cover, no weapon. Japanese soldiers in the trench were firing at him with rifles and grenades. He could see at least 6 enemy combatants. He ran for the Stinger. A grenade exploded 5 yards behind him, throwing volcanic ash and shrapnel. Fragments hit his left leg and back. Small wounds, painful, but not incapacitating. He grabbed the Stinger and dove. Into the crater. The receiver had a deep gouge where the bullet had struck. Stein cycled the action manually. It was stiff but functional. He loaded a fresh belt, aimed at the trench, and fired. The Stinger worked, barely. The rate of fire was down to maybe 600 rounds per minute, half its original capability, but 600 rounds per minute was still faster than anything else on the battlefield. Stein suppressed the trench while riflemen advanced with grenades. The position was cleared, 6 Japanese soldiers dead. Company A's advance continued. By 1500 hours, Stein had made his 8th successful trip to the beach and back. He had fired well over 2,000 rounds. He had carried wounded Marines on every single return trip. His feet were bloody from running barefoot through the volcanic ash. His uniform was soaked with sweat and the blood of the wounded men he had carried. And the Stinger was barely functional. The weapon's barrel was bent at a noticeable 5-degree angle. The stock was held together by friction and sheer will. The solenoid trigger fired randomly, sometimes 1 round, sometimes 5, sometimes nothing. Stein had to manually cycle the action between every burst, but Company A had achieved its objective. They were at the base of Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominated the southern tip of the island. The mountain rose 550 feet above sea level. Japanese observers on the summit could see every American position on the beach. Artillery spotters directed fire from the heights. The mountain had to be taken at all costs. At 1700 hours, Stein's platoon was ordered to establish a defensive perimeter and hold their position for the night. The final assault on Suribachi would begin the next morning. For now, Company A needed to consolidate, resupply, and prepare for inevitable counterattacks. Stein finally had time to assess his own condition. His feet were torn and bleeding. Volcanic ash had worked its way into every cut, beginning to turn them into infected wounds. He had shrapnel fragments embedded in his left calf and lower back. Minor wounds, but they would require treatment. His hands were badly blistered from continuously handling the hot stinger, and he was utterly exhausted. He had been in continuous combat for 8 grueling hours. He had run approximately 3 miles total across those 8 trips to the beach, carrying wounded men, carrying ammunition, all under fire, and barefoot. The stinger lay beside him in the fighting hole. The weapon was effectively destroyed. The barrel would require immediate replacement. The receiver was damaged. The stock was burned. The trigger mechanism was wholly unreliable, but it had performed its job perfectly. It had kept Company A moving forward when conventional weapons would have left them hopelessly pinned on the beach. Other Marines had already started calling him the barefoot corporal. Some still thought he was insane. Others called him the most courageous man they had ever seen. Stein didn't care about either assessment. He had simply done what needed to be done. The mathematics had been simple. His platoon needed fire support. The stinger provided it. Everything else was irrelevant. That night, while Stein desperately tried to sleep in his fighting hole, Japanese infiltrators began probing Company A's perimeter. Small groups, 2 or 3 soldiers, testing the defenses, searching for weak points. Stein grabbed the stinger. Despite its immense damage, it still retained one powerful advantage: volume of fire. When a Japanese soldier appeared 30 yards from his position, Stein fired a burst. The weapon worked. The infiltrator died. By dawn on February 20th, Stein had been awake for 22 consecutive hours. The assault on Mount Suribachi began at 0800. Company A, alongside the rest of the 28th Marines, began the arduous climb up the volcanic slopes. The terrain was brutal: loose ash, no vegetation, and exposed ridges where Japanese observers could see every movement. The enemy had fortified the mountain with over 60 pillboxes, bunkers, and cave positions. Every single approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Japanese soldiers had spent months preparing these defenses. They had stockpiled ammunition, food, and water inside the mountain's tunnel system. They fully intended to make the Americans pay dearly for every yard. Stein carried the stinger up the mountain. An armorer had worked on it overnight, replacing the most visibly damaged components. The barrel was still bent, but a new belt feed mechanism had been installed. The solenoid trigger was slightly more reliable. The weapon would fire, but it was no longer the devastating precision tool it had been. At 0930, Company A encountered a reinforced bunker complex halfway up the southern slope. 4 concrete bunkers connected by trenches, multiple machine gun positions, mortar crews firing from concealed pits. The 28th Marines' advance stalled completely. Stein moved forward with the stinger. He quickly identified the primary bunker and opened fire. The damaged barrel meant the weapon's accuracy had decreased significantly, but at close range, volume of fire still mattered most. He suppressed the position long enough for demolition teams to crawl forward with satchel charges. The bunker was destroyed. Company A advanced another 50 yards. At 10:15, Stein's luck finally ran out. A Japanese grenade landed 3 feet from his position. He saw it. He tried to move. The grenade detonated before he could get completely clear. Shrapnel struck his right arm, right leg, and torso. Multiple wounds, none immediately fatal, but he was bleeding heavily. Corpsmen reached him within minutes. They quickly bandaged the wounds and urgently called for evacuation. Stein flatly refused. His platoon was still heavily engaged. The stinger was still critically needed. He continued fighting. For the next 2 hours, Stein provided relentless fire support while bleeding through his thick bandages. The stinger continued to function despite the severe beating it had taken. Every time a pillbox opened fire on advancing Marines, Stein suppressed it. Every time Japanese soldiers appeared in trench systems, he cut them down with sustained bursts. But by 12:30, Stein's wounds had critically worsened. He had lost a significant amount of blood. He was becoming severely lightheaded. His vision was beginning to narrow. Corpsmen told him directly that he needed immediate evacuation, or he would surely die on the mountain. This time, Stein did not argue. He handed the stinger to another Marine in his squad and allowed the corpsman to carry him down the mountain to the beach. From there, he was loaded onto a landing craft and transported to a hospital ship anchored offshore. On February 21st, while Stein recovered on the hospital ship, the 28th Marines continued their brutal assault on Mount Suribachi. The fighting was savage. Every single cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers and high explosives. Every trench had to be taken in close quarters combat. Japanese soldiers fought fanatically to the death rather than surrender. On February 23rd at 10:20 in the morning, a patrol from Company E reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They raised a small American flag. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the emotional moment. Later that afternoon, a larger flag was raised. Rosenthal photographed that too. The resulting image became the most iconic photograph of the entire Pacific War. Stein was not present for the flag raising. He was on the hospital ship receiving intensive treatment for his wounds. Doctors removed shrapnel from his arm, leg, and torso. They treated him for severe blood loss and infection. They informed him he would be sent to a rear area hospital in Hawaii or potentially back to the United States. His war was officially over. But on February 25th, news reached the hospital ship that impacted Stein harder than any grenade. The 5th Marine Division had moved north from Suribachi toward the center of the island. They were assaulting a position designated Hill 362A. The fighting there was brutal. The 28th Marines were suffering catastrophic casualties. Company A had lost 30% of its strength in just 2 days. Stein's platoon sergeant was dead. His squad leader was dead. Marines he had trained with in Hawaii were dying on a nameless hill in the center of Iwo Jima. On February 26th, against strict medical orders, Tony Stein left the hospital ship. He climbed down into a landing craft, returning to the beach. He falsely told the boat crew he had been cleared to return to duty. He had not been cleared. He was officially AWOL from the hospital ship. But nobody stopped him. He reached the beach at 1400 hours. He located a supply sergeant and requisitioned new boots. His feet were still bandaged, but he could walk. He grabbed an M1 Garand rifle from a supply dump. The Stinger was gone, either destroyed or now being used by another, Marine. It didn't matter. Stein was going back to his unit. He walked north across Iwo Jima, 6 miles, through volcanic ash and past destroyed Japanese positions, past burned-out tanks and scattered equipment, past Graves registration teams collecting American dead. He reached Company A's position at Hill 362A on February 27th. The company had been reduced to 63 men from its original strength of 240. The survivors were utterly exhausted. They had been fighting continuously for 8 brutal days. They had no rest, no relief, just endless combat against an enemy that refused to surrender. Stein reported to the company commander. He was put back on the line immediately. Company A needed every single rifle. For the next 2 days, Stein fought in the brutal close-quarters combat around Hill 362A. No Stinger, just an M1 Garand and grenades. The fighting was different without the improvised machine gun, slower, more deliberate. But Stein was still incredibly effective. On March 1st, 1945, Company A was tasked with a reconnaissance patrol to locate a complex of Japanese pillboxes that had been relentlessly harassing the regiment's advance. The patrol consisted of 19 Marines. Corporal Tony Stein was designated assistant patrol leader. Their mission was to move forward approximately 400 yards, locate the precise enemy positions, and return with actionable intelligence. No assault, just reconnaissance. At 0700 on March 1st, the patrol moved out from Company A's lines. The terrain consisted of volcanic ridges and ravines, perfect for a surprise ambush. Japanese soldiers had established concealed positions throughout the entire area. Snipers, machine gun nests, mortar teams, all hidden in caves and spider holes. The patrol moved slowly. 20 yards. Stop. Observe. Listen. 20 more yards. The Marines knew that Japanese defenders were actively watching them. The question was precisely when the enemy would open fire. At 07:45, the patrol reached a ridgeline overlooking a small valley. Stein moved to the front to get a superior view of the terrain ahead. Through the volcanic rock formations, he could clearly see what looked like expertly camouflaged positions, possibly pillboxes, possibly cave entrances. The patrol needed to move closer to confirm. Stein signaled the patrol to advance. He stepped forward, M1 Garand at the ready. His feet, still heavily bandaged from the barefoot runs 8 days earlier, ached with every step. The shrapnel wounds in his right arm and leg had not fully healed, but he moved forward because that was simply what needed to be done. At ZU 752, a single sharp shot rang out. The bullet struck Tony Stein in the head. He dropped instantly. The shot had come from a concealed position approximately 200 yards northeast, likely a spider hole or cave entrance. The patrol could not see the shooter. Corpsmen reached Stein within seconds, but there was absolutely nothing they could do. The wound was instantly fatal. Corporal Tony Stein, age 23, died on the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima at ZO 753 on March 1, 1945. The patrol returned fire toward the suspected sniper position. Marines called in mortar support. The area was quickly saturated with high explosives. Whether the sniper died in the bombardment was never confirmed. Japanese soldiers rarely left bodies where Americans could find them. The patrol successfully completed its mission. They identified the pillbox complex and returned to Company A with the vital intelligence, but they carried Tony Stein's body back with them. News of Stein's death spread rapidly and sorrowfully through the 28th Marines. The barefoot corporal, who had made 8 superhuman trips to the beach on February 19th, the Marine who had refused evacuation after being wounded, the toolmaker from Dayton, who had built a revolutionary weapon from salvaged aircraft parts and used it to destroy more enemy positions than anyone could possibly count. On March the 2nd, Stein was buried in the 5th Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima. A simple wooden cross marked his grave, his service number, his rank, his unit. No mention of the Stinger, no mention of the Medal of Honor that would later deservedly bear his name. The brutal battle for Iwo Jima continued for another 24 days after Stein's death. The fighting remained savage. The 28th Marines pushed north, relentlessly clearing cave complexes and fortified positions. American casualties mounted dramatically. By March 26th, when the island was finally declared secure, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead and 20,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were far worse. Of the 21,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived. The rest died in their positions or committed suicide rather than surrender. The vast tunnel systems beneath Iwo Jima became mass graves. But on February 19th, during those first 8 critical hours of combat, Tony Stein and his improvised weapon had made an indelible difference. His barefoot runs had saved 9 wounded Marines, who would almost certainly have died on the beach. His overwhelming suppressive fire had allowed Company A to advance when all other units were hopelessly pinned down. His mechanical ingenuity had, for one day, given the Marine Corps a weapon that fundamentally changed the tactical equation. The 5 other Stingers built by Mel Grevich and John Little also saw combat on Iwo Jima. 2 were destroyed by enemy fire. 1 jammed permanently from overheating. The other 2 survived the battle, but were lost in the chaos of equipment disposal after the war. None of the original 6 Stingers exist today. They were purely field modifications, non-standard equipment, the kind of weapons the military typically destroys rather than preserves. But the legend of the Stinger lived on powerfully in Marine Corps history. Armorers and mechanics heard the story. The toolmaker from Ohio, who salvaged aircraft machine guns and adapted them into ground infantry weapons, who ran barefoot through volcanic ash to keep his fighting platoon supplied, who refused evacuation when grievously wounded, who returned to combat when he should have been safe on a hospital ship. In May 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson submitted a recommendation for Tony Stein to receive the Medal of Honor. The recommendation detailed Stein's extraordinary actions on February 19th, the 8 trips to the beach, the wounded Marines evacuated, the enemy positions destroyed, the barefoot runs under fire. The recommendation was unanimously endorsed by every officer in the chain of command: regiment, division, Fleet Marine Force, Pacific Command. Everyone who reviewed the after-action reports agreed. Corporal Tony Stein had demonstrated conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after Stein's actions on Iwo Jima, his widow Joan received his Medal of Honor in a solemn ceremony at the Ohio State House. Ohio Governor Frank Lauscha presented the medal. Joan Stein stood in his office, completely overwhelmed by the profound weight of the decoration and the painful memories it represented. Tony's mother, Rose, attended the ceremony, tears streaming down her face. Her son, the child of Jewish immigrants who had dropped out of high school to work as a toolmaker, had received the nation's highest military honor. The Medal of Honor citation read in part, "The first man of his unit to be on station after hitting the beach in the initial assault, Corporal Stein, armed with a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, provided rapid covering fire as the remainder of his platoon attempted to move into position. When his comrades were stalled by a concentrated machine gun and mortar barrage, he gallantly stood upright and exposed himself to the enemy's view, thereby drawing the hostile fire to his own person and enabling him to observe the location of the furiously blazing hostile guns. Determined to neutralize the strategically placed weapons, he boldly charged the enemy pillboxes one by one and succeeded in killing 20 of the enemy during the furious single-handed assault." The citation continued for 3 more paragraphs, detailing each of his 8 trips to the beach, the wounded Marines he evacuated, and his steadfast refusal to seek medical treatment despite his wounds. It mentioned the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, but did not use the name Stinger. That name existed only in Marine Corps oral history. Tony Stein's remains stayed on Iwo Jima until 1948. In December of that year, his body was returned to Dayton for burial with full military honors. The ceremony at Our Lady of the Rosary Church drew hundreds of mourners, veterans, family, civilians who had never met him but deeply understood what he represented. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Dayton, the only Medal of Honor recipient from that city in World War II. His grave marker lists his rank, his unit, and the high decoration he earned. Visitors still leave coins and small American flags at the site. In 1972, the United States Navy commissioned USS Stein, a Knox-class frigate, in his honor. The ship served for 21 years, participating in complex operations in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It was decommissioned in 1993 and eventually scrapped, but the name Tony Stein lived on permanently in naval records. The Marine Corps preserved his incredible story in training materials and official historical accounts. At Parris Island, the recruit depot where new Marines begin their service, instructors teach about improvisation and adaptation in combat. Tony Stein's story is a core part of that curriculum. The toolmaker who built a powerful weapon from salvaged aircraft parts, the Marine who ran barefoot through volcanic ash to save his brothers, the one who refused evacuation when wounded. The Stinger itself became a powerful legend in military firearms history. Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons documented the weapon's innovative design and history. The Canadian Historical Arms Museum built a fully functional replica for educational purposes. That replica clearly demonstrated what Stein and Grevich had accomplished with basic tools and simple mechanical knowledge. They had taken an aircraft machine gun designed for 300 Mipioids airstreams and adapted it for intense ground combat. They had solved the Marine Corps' crucial firepower problem with salvaged parts and pure ingenuity. Military historians often debate whether the Stinger was truly tactically significant. 6 weapons across 1 regiment. A limited impact on the overall battle. But those 6 weapons made an undeniable, profound difference to the Marines who fought alongside them. The overwhelming suppressive fire allowed rapid advances that would otherwise have stalled. The psychological impact of 1:200 rounds per minute kept enemy heads down at the most critical moments. What is absolutely not debatable is Tony Stein's courage. 8 trips under fire, 9 wounded Marines evacuated. Barefoot runs through razor-sharp volcanic ash. Refusing evacuation when wounded. Returning from a hospital ship to rejoin his unit. Leading a patrol that cost him his life. The barefoot corporal from Dayton represents something fundamental about the Marine Corps ethos. Improvise, adapt, overcome. When standard equipment fails, build something better. When wounded, keep fighting. When ordered to rest, return to your unit. When faced with impossible odds, charge forward. Tony Stein was 23 years old when he died. He had been a Marine for 2 years and 5 months. He fought on 2 islands. He killed more enemy soldiers than official records could possibly count. He saved 9 lives on a single day. And he did it all with a revolutionary weapon he helped build in a maintenance shed in Hawaii. If this incredible story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this essential story to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We are committed to rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tool makers and Marines who saved lives with salvaged aircraft guns and barefoot courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're an active part of keeping these vital memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family bravely served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Tony Stein doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.